All right, I am seeing people pop into the discussion, the chat. So I suppose we'll get started, get moving. Thanks, everybody. This is an overview of Drupal front-end component integration methods. And I'm Brian Perry. There's a link there to bit.ly/component-int. And that's going to link you to a GitHub repository that has a little sandbox for the examples that we'll be going through, along with the slides and also links to slides and videos for past versions of this talk. So yeah, thanks for everybody for dropping in on this. It's early here where I am. But I think I'm awake enough to do this. So I'm Brian Perry, and I am a front-end developer at a company called Bounteous. And I live in the Chicago suburbs in the United States. It's 6:30 in the morning here, but I got a cup of coffee. I'm a lover of all things component-driven and component-based, so building with components in Drupal and design systems and tools like Pattern Lab and Storybook, and then increasingly building with JavaScript component-based frameworks like React, and also increasingly interested in web components. And I'm also a big Nintendo fan. So if you're playing any cool games on your Nintendo Switch, love to talk about that. I just started playing Hades, which is a really cool roguelike game. I'm enjoying that, and still keeping up with Animal Crossing. Looking forward to decorating for the holiday season. And I'm also online in a bunch of different places, so would love to internet with you. All right. So as I mentioned, I work for a company called Bounteous. We have offices throughout North America. Drupal is one of a handful of things that we do, but I primarily work within the Drupal practice, learn from a bunch of great folks on a day-to-day basis. And we're often hiring, so if you're looking to do great Drupal work, get in touch. And if you're looking to have great Drupal work done, I can also get you in touch with somebody. And thanks as always to Bounteous for supporting me doing these talks and taking the time to participate and contribute. So let's dive in and just talk about components at a high level very briefly. So not going to spend too much time, selling on the concept of component-based development. There's definitely a lot of talks and writing on that particular topic, but it's the general idea of creating modular and reusable elements and building a design system rather than a series of pages. So this approach of breaking things down to its smaller pieces, popularized by Brad Frost's atomic design, it can be used along with a pattern library tool for documentation and prototyping, things like Pattern Lab and Storybook, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. You can still just take this general approach to building without using a tool like that. And it also helps decouple front-end and back-end development in some interesting ways, in that you can build your front-end components first before things are fully fleshed out in Drupal. So we're just going to basically look at one example from a bunch of different perspectives today. So here's our example Twig component. It's I use the nes.css library, which lets us make these cool, like old school Nintendo looking components. I wasn't kidding about my love for Nintendo. And we're just going to use their container here. So we have our little container component, and here are the various pieces of it. It has a title, a couple of tags, a platform and a year, an image, body, and a CTA. So just kind of stepping through the structure of the component itself. Here's a quick look at the markup. Nothing all that complicated here. There's some wrapping divs that include the classes that nes.css needs to display the container. There's some logic to only display portions of it depending on data being available. And obviously the Twig variables that we're going to be passing data into. And then if you are using a tool like Pattern Lab, for example, this example I do have a Pattern Lab instance for. You may have a YAML file or JSON file like this that contains example data for your component. So this will just allow us in Pattern Lab, for example, to render this particular example of the component and see what it looks like. So now we can focus on components in Drupal. So throughout this talk, I'm just kind of going to draw a few different dividing lines. And the first one is where your components live. So for the sake of this talk, I'm going to split things into standard Drupal components and integrated Drupal components. And we'll spend more time talking about the integrated Drupal components. But so standard Drupal components in this case live in Drupal's default template directory. The templates are exactly where Drupal would expect them to be. And because of that, it might not require much additional effort to get data to display in them. And then integrated Drupal components, the main difference there is that they just live somewhere other than the default templates directory. So as a result of that, it's going to require some amount of additional effort to get data to display. And from the perspective of this talk, it doesn't really matter how your integrated components are made available to your theme. They could be just in your theme and in your code base. They could be an external dependency, but the integration process is going to be the same. So briefly talking about standard Drupal components, it certainly may be the right approach for your team or your project, and there's nothing wrong with that. So here you'd be building with Drupal and essentially only Drupal in mind and taking advantage of things that can be easily reused in Drupal. So display modes, blocks, paragraphs if you use paragraphs, layouts. You're potentially going to lose out on rapid prototyping advantages of using a separate tool. You have to stand things up in Drupal to be able to really see what they're going to look like. So just a quick look at our container from the perspective of just a standard Drupal component. So we're going to be using a teaser view mode to represent this. And then we also have a game content type with a number of different fields. And this is how they map into the, essentially the slots we have in our component. So label is the title, there's content field platform, image, body, and so on. So to get things to display as this container component, we're basically creating our own version of the node game teaser.html.twig template, the template suggestion for that. And we're just adjusting it as we need to render as the container. So for our classes here, a handful of these things are things for the default node template, but we're also adding like our NES container with title and is centered. And then throughout the template, we're also just adjusting the markup in our Twig template so that it has the right structure and adds the necessary classes. So now shifting over to integrated Drupal components and the various ways to approach that. Again, this is building with components that live somewhere outside of the default templates directory. So as I mentioned, for this example, in the sandbox, we have a Pattern Lab instance. So there is this NES components directory in this custom theme, and it follows the general default Pattern Lab structure. There's a source directory and subfolders for patterns, and we have a directory for our container component that has the Twig template and a YAML file. And we can see what it looks like in Pattern Lab, examples of our markup, and then our component with that example data. So if you're taking this approach, you'll most likely need to use the components module. I think I saw John Albin in the chat who maintains this, and thanks for building something that many of these things are all built on top of. But that allows Drupal to discover templates that live somewhere outside of the default templates directory, and also allows us to create these Twig namespaces that we can use to reference these things. So in our theme, under this component libraries key, we just created a component namespace that points to that components directory in our pattern lab instance. So that lets Drupal find it, and also we can reference it with the @components Twig namespace, which we'll see. So now another kind of way to look at this is the integration approaches, which primarily falls into two categories: mapping data in code versus mapping data in the admin UI. So mapping in code, that's going to cover things like mapping in Twig templates or various approaches to pre-processing. This approach, from my experience, is more likely to get out of sync with Drupal's admin UI. So for example, it might not reflect what is being displayed on the manage display tab. And if you're not careful, also potentially is more likely to break things like caching or things that Drupal depend on if you strip out too many things. So things like quick edit or layout builder, there can be problems there. So alternatively, mapping data in the admin UI is includes things like the UI patterns modules, Drupal layouts, and also I find this is a little bit less likely to disrupt Drupal functionality, but potentially not as flexible in that each of these kind of have their own conventions that you need to follow. So looking at an example of integrating in code, we're still using our teaser view mode here, and essentially have all the same fields from our content type that we're going to be passing in. So we'll first look at mapping data in a Twig presenter template. So the idea of a presenter template, it's kind of like a traffic cop in the middle that is taking Drupal's data and directing it over to our template in the pattern library. So we're still using that same template suggestion of node game teaser.html.twig. But here, really what we're doing is we're using a Twig include statement to reference that C container Twig template, and then we're passing in the necessary fields from the game content type into the slots in the component. And then alternatively, if we didn't want to do this in a Twig template, you could also do the same thing in preprocess. So this is a preprocess hook for the game node. And it's basically the most simple preprocess function of all time. It just takes those fields and maps them to the expected variables that are going to be in our component template. Obviously, there's quite a bit more that you can do here, but this is just the simple high-level example. And if you take that preprocess approach, you can potentially use a simpler include in your Twig templates. You don't have to map out all of the fields like we saw there, because they're going to be available to your template. And if you're taking this approach, especially the Twig mapping approach, there's a handful of helper modules that are going to make your life easier. A couple of ones that I've used commonly are Twig field value and Twig tweak. Twig field value lets you get partial data from field render arrays, so you can really map just the data that you want and strip away some wrapping markup. And then Twig tweak has just tons of functions and filters that can be helpful. So if you find something that you're trying to do in Twig template that is challenging, odds are pretty high that Twig tweak or something like it may have solved the problem already for you. Also, in this neighborhood, there's a number of different starter kits and themes. We won't get too deep into this, but the general idea here is that they're going to help simplify your setup and provide opinionated default tooling. Some also have default components and some helper functions. It's going to vary how opinionated they are. but they can be really useful, especially if you want to start out with kind of a strong starting point and your tooling out of the way. So some examples: MULSIFY is a pretty popular option in the community. There's also Gesso and Shyla, along with Particle, and all these are great options if you do want an opinionated starting point. So won't get, again, too deep into examples here, but I thought it might be interesting to look at the Emulsify design system, the most recent version of that, which uses Storybook as opposed to Pattern Lab, because the integration approach here is essentially the same, even though it uses a different tool. So still using the concept of the presenter templates in the middle to map the data. The components live in a different place per Emulsify and Storybook's conventions, and it uses a different tool. But we still can see in Storybook our container template. And then, we're using a different approach to make Storybook aware of our story in this case. It's the stories.js file, but conceptually what we're doing here is pretty similar. We are importing our Twig template and then the data from a YAML file and rendering out our example. And then, at the end of the day, in our Emulsify subtheme, we can still see our container components in a grid here. And the approach is essentially the same. Okay, so now moving on to mapping data in the admin UI. So we'll start by looking at the UI patterns module. The way I like to describe UI patterns is a way to define and manage components in a way that Drupal better understands. So UI patterns are Drupal plugins, and when you define a UI pattern, you can actually handle the sort of mappings that we looked at in Drupal's admin UI in a variety of different places. And you can also enable an optional pattern library page, kind of like a mini pattern lab that's available in Drupal. And it also lets you do things like pre-process your patterns and render them programmatically in a variety of different ways. So looking again back at our container component, but this time from the perspective of a UI pattern. So the thing we're dealing with here is a container pattern that we're going to create. And then the slots are all the same. It's the same variables from the Twig template that we've seen before. So to define our UI pattern, we use a pattern.yaml file in this case. And the pattern has its own ID of container, a label, and a description. And then the bulk of what we see here is mapping out the different fields. So for each field, you can have a type and a label and description, and then preview content. So a lot of these are just strings, but we've also got some examples of markup. It's possible to have a preview that is another pattern if you're doing pattern nesting. And then down towards the bottom of this YAML file, there's a couple of other cool tricks that UI patterns can do. So it's possible to define libraries. So if you have certain assets that need to be loaded every time this component is used, you can do that. And you can also have other dependencies or use these libraries as dependencies. So here we're just loading a CSS file. And then the use key down at the bottom tells UI patterns that when this component is being used, to use that C container template from our pattern library. So it essentially eliminates the need for that presenter template in the middle. Behind the scenes, something pretty similar is going on, but we don't have to maintain that additional template in the code base, for example. So this is what it looks like in the example pattern page. Obviously, it'll be a little less crazy when it's not using this 8-bit framework. But we see our container component with its example data, and then a table that has all of the fields that we've defined with some other metadata. And then UI patterns has a handful of supporting integration modules. We'll just look at one as a quick example. So UI patterns views in this case. So in our view, we can specify that we're going to show a pattern. And then in the row style options, we pick the pattern that we want to use, our container component again. And then for each field in a row for our view, we can specify the destination in our UI pattern. So we can map things here in the UI on a field by field basis. And the other integration modules, it's going to be a similar approach, but using other things like layouts as opposed to views. And the end result there is that we'll see our container again. So also, we could use a layout in Drupal to represent this component. So here, the thing that we're dealing with is a container layout. And layouts have regions. So those are essentially the things that we're going to be mapping into the different slots in our container. A handful of ways to define layouts for Drupal. This quick example just uses a layouts.yaml file in our theme. And so we're specifying a template that's used for the layout, which has to have a html.twig extension, and then listing out our various regions that are going to be used. So in our presenter template, we're including that container.twig, and then we're mapping the regions in this case into the different slots in our component. So, one thing to keep in mind here is that if you're taking this approach and, mapping data in a Twig template, you need to make sure that you're not stripping out too much of what Layout Builder depends on when it renders the component. So you'll see here, you need to use the attributes object, and there's certain classes and wrapping markup that need to be here so that the Layout Builder UI can hook into your component. So you can't strip away too much. And then another thing that this means is that your pattern library tool is going to need to understand things like the add class function. And that's definitely a solved problem, but might not be something that is configured out of the box for you. So here we see our container component represented as a layout in Layout Builder. And you'll notice that as we represent this visually, things get a little funky. So there are some cases where this visual approach might make sense and others where it potentially does not. We see our tags of our platform and our year start to overlap things. Also, if there are cases where there's data that isn't necessarily represented visually, but it can be configured to specify like what how a component behaves, for example. That's something you don't want represented visually in your layout either. But recently, there is the component blocks module that kind of bridges this gap in some interesting ways. So it exposes UI patterns to Layout Builder. And as we'll see in a second, it kind of sidesteps some of those visual issues that we just saw in that simple example. And makes any fields available to the particular entity that you're working with available to map into your UI pattern, along with fixed inputs. So you can just enter data by hand too. So here we're adding a block in Layout Builder, and we'll see in the sidebar on the right that there's a component blocks options for our container now. So we can specify fields from content or fields from user, because the user entity is also available in this context. And then we picked fields from content, and then you'll see that still in the sidebar, we can configure all of those mappings and how things are going to be rendered. So, for the title, we can specify a formatter if it's going to be linked. The source below is an example of using a fixed value. And then for something like an image, we can specify the image formatter and image styles and all of that good stuff. And as you'll see here, it does this in the sidebar, or if you're using Layout Builder modal, it would do it in the modal rather than doing it visually. So it kind of sidesteps some of those issues. So it's kind of a good mix in that you can configure the settings for your pattern, but still have it represented visually in the kind of overall page layout. Also kind of in this neighborhood, but a little bit more focused on the decoupled use case is the component module. Confusingly, not the components module. And this is another way that you can define a component with a YAML file. It's kind of like intended to be a successor to the progressively decoupled blocks module, if anyone has used that. So it's pretty similar in concept. And we'll look at an example in a second, but you can define the component in your YAML file. It's also possible to derive block configuration from it. And then the other thing that it does is it will, for any configuration in the block, it will also add those to the wrapping div as data attributes so that you can get at them when you load your component. So this actually isn't the container example, but it's still just a representative example here. We have our YAML file on the left-hand side. So potentially, depending on what you're looking to do, there might not actually have to be a lot of configuration here, but we have just a JavaScript component that we're loading. We're specifying a template file, and then there's just one configuration option under form configuration, which picking a dark or light theme. And then in this example, in the template file, it really is just a div with a particular ID. So React in this case can mount in that div. And then taking just a quick look at the component itself. So here, we're mounting in that evolution navbar div, but also before the render function, we're getting the all of the data for the that evolution navbar class, which is what is added by this component in this case, so that we then have all those data attributes that we can pass into our component when we render it. So we're, in this case, specifying the theme based on what is selected in the block when you add it in Drupal. So we'll see there that there's the component settings, and we can pick from the dark and light theme. So can be pretty helpful, especially in the more decoupled use case. So now let's move on to component definition approaches, another kind of dividing line here. So a lot of what we've looked at, actually everything we've looked at so far, falls under the category of manual definition. So we're defining our component in code to make Drupal aware of it. And this potentially is going to result in some amount of duplication between Drupal and your component library. Like for the UI patterns case, the way we have to map out the fields is probably pretty similar to how you need to map out the data for Pattern Lab or Storybook to be aware of. So there's the concept of automatic discovery, which in this case, a Drupal module discovers components from a component library and automatically makes them available to Drupal. So this is, in many cases an emerging or experimental concept. In a past version of this talk, somebody brought up the great point that, a lot of these are development modules. So, use your typical judgment with that. And also, this is going to expect a particular convention. So it might not work with all component libraries, but can be a useful tool, especially if you, build with this in mind. So looking at some examples of automatic discovery, one is UI Patterns Pattern Lab, which is a module that I maintain. So here it just, again, discovers your components from a Pattern Lab instance and automatically makes them available in Drupal as UI patterns. And you don't have to create a separate patterns.yaml file. It does require that you have a YAML or JSON file that has pattern data, because that. I think my headset may have just cut out, so if somebody in the chat could just ping and confirm that they can hear me, that would be amazing. All right, cool, great. Thanks. All right, so yeah, so this is potentially a useful approach if you want to prevent that sort of duplication. And then also there is PatternKit, which is not maintained by me. It's maintained by the folks at Red Hat. And this kind of has a mix of some of the manual definition and automatic discovery concepts. It depends on a schema definition file. But that schema definition file has potential applications outside of Drupal. And this is another approach that can automatically derive blocks from pattern library components. And it supports a particular set of field types when doing that. The module, at least last that I played around with this, was still in active development for Drupal 8. So some things that are supported in 7 haven't quite made their way there yet. But here's a quick look at pattern discovery from the perspective of PatternKit. So in your libraries.yaml file, there's a patterns key where you specify the path to your patterns. In this case, that it's their Twig patterns. And then this is an example of the a JSON file, JSON schema file. So, at a high level, this is pretty similar to some of the other examples that we've seen where we're, mapping out the different fields. So that's under the properties section here. But for the fields, you can specify a type and potentially some options. So for the string type down in the body section, we're specifying that it's a text area and that it should use a WYSIWYG. And then also it's possible to include settings that can be configured when this pattern is used. So again, all that is automatically derived for Drupal. And then that can result in something that looks like this. When you add a block for the container, in this case, you have fields where you can specify the data for your components. And also we see the example of the alignment settings as well that can be specified. And then that still gives you the container component that we've seen over and over and over. And then another module that was pointed out to me recently by one of the maintainers, I guess, even a module might not be the right way to describe this, but is the Wingsuit project. And this is a set of tools that help you build Twig UI components with Storybook. I haven't really had too much of a chance to play around with this, but and I also wasn't exactly sure at this point which category this really belonged in, but I thought it was worth noting. It does rely on UI patterns. So it uses the UI pattern structure that we've seen along with some additional features that it adds. One cool thing that it can do is allow you to generate components via a CLI. Which is kind of nice, a way to kind of bootstrap a component. There's also a Wingsuit companion module that lets you make these components available to Drupal with no additional configuration. And also there's a starter project, a Wingsuit Kickstarter project that's going to give you example components and a quick way to get started. So definitely worth checking out. And I plan on looking into it more myself. So finally, as we kind of near the end here, we'll talk about prepackaged component solutions. So just briefly touching on a few of these, there's the Bolt design system built out of Pegasystems. So this is a set of ready-to-use and Drupal-friendly web components. And it's a full design system, and you can pick and choose the pieces that you want to use. So definitely worth looking at, especially if you're interested in seeing, a fully built out web component-based design system. There's also the Compony project, which is a component distribution system. And this is like a combination of a theme, gulp workflow, and also example components that you can pick from. So you can download existing components. You can also create and distribute your own. At least when I looked at this previously, it didn't have like a composer or npm driven workflow. So for that reason, it probably doesn't really fit into my my workflow. But again, this idea of finding different ways to easily distribute Drupal-friendly components is something that I find pretty interesting. And then there's also the single file components module. And this doesn't really help with the integration use case, but is definitely another interesting perspective on making easily packageable and distributable Drupal components. So it uses something similar to the Vue's single file component syntax. And you can use it like any template, but it just happens to include all of the markup and JavaScript and styles in one place. And it can also do some of the cool tricks that we've seen in other examples, like generate libraries, derive blocks and layouts if you annotate things correctly. And it does have its own little mini component library as well. So another interesting take on component distribution and reuse here. And then related to that, an ongoing effort and potentially something we'll hear more about in the Dries note in a bit, is the initiative to create a distributable Drupal-friendly menu component. So, this is another situation where I'm, in addition to, the effort to make that available, I'm hoping that there are some patterns that can be established here that can also kind of reverberate out throughout the component ecosystem as well that we can learn from. And just touching on the workflow here, kind of my approach currently, I still am kind of leveraging a mix of these approaches. So I typically do use integrated components that are in a custom theme, so things live outside of the traditional Drupal templates directory. For lightweight components, I do prefer to handle the component mapping in Drupal's UI where I can. But for things that are more complicated, I tend to use preprocess, especially rather than mapping in Twig templates. We've developed some tools to make that process a little bit easier, and then also at Bounteous, our team, our backend team, has gotten pretty good at putting together helper functions that make that integration process a little bit easier. And then also are focusing on building components that are compatible with Layout Builder and can be used easily with Layout Builder. And from my perspective, that lately has meant mostly using custom block types and a pretty limited use of paragraphs. And a question that has come up when talking about this topic previously is, well, what should I do if I want to take this approach? And I would still say at this point, the best introduction is one of the approaches of handling mapping in code. It's a pretty battle-tested approach here. Which approach you pick is probably going to depend on your team makeup and your project. So for people who are a little bit more front-end focused, the Twig mapping approach might be a better place to start versus if the back-end team is handling this integration, might be more inclined to pre-process. But as we saw a lot of examples today that are kind of consolidating around UI patterns and the UI patterns ecosystem, that's definitely getting close to the point where that could be my recommendation. I just think one of the challenges there is that there's just a lot to that ecosystem, and it's a little bit complicated to get your head around the tools and the options at first. So it's potentially a little bit of a challenging starting point. But as your experience grows, those tools can definitely provide a lot of value. And we're pretty much up on time, so I got to wrap up here. But also, a lot of what we talked about distributing components is part of my ideal workflow. I'm spoiled by working within React projects or other JavaScript frameworks where there's a lot of fully packaged components that you can easily install and then just import them where you need them. So overall, I feel like we have a lot of these pieces, maybe even too many pieces, but need either a little extra magic or some best practices to kind of make it clearer how all these tools can be used together to improve the general component workflow. So making it easier to package and distribute components, I think, can make a big difference. And I'm certainly eyeing the progress of web components there. I do continue to think it's important to improve the ability to handle these types of mappings in the Drupal UI. But as we talked about, there's been a number of interesting developments there that are kind of closing that gap. And also, I do think I'd want to see the evolution continue in ways to automatically discover components. But overall, I think we should just all keep building amazing looking component-based sites using Drupal. And do want to make sure to thank the many folks that are part of this little mini corner of the Drupal world and have contributed and created these tools and taught me things. And I'm very happy to just be a small piece of the puzzle. Speaking of that, definitely check out the contribution day on Friday. There's going to be, I'm sure, a lot of interesting component-related work going on, and also probably thoughts around that decoupled menu module. And would be very interested in anybody's feedback. If there's, I believe, a way to provide feedback on the session node. So would appreciate if you could rate and provide your thoughts. And I know we're a little tight on time, but hopefully I can jump over to a couple of the questions. And if there's anything left over, I'll also, I can answer them in the on-air app. But it looks like there's just a couple. So Tom asks, do you think the UI patterns module is still relevant with all that layout API stuff in core? That's a good question. I do think that it is still relevant. I don't know if this is what you're getting at, but it would be nice if some of those things could, if there was a way that some of those things could consolidate. But I still think that UI patterns provides a number of tools and a little bit of a more component focused approach, and does some things that Layout Builder can't. So things like the component blocks module that we talked about, it makes it really, really easy to have components that can be easily used with Layout Builder. So yeah, I would look specifically at UI patterns with that component blocks module. And that is the best example of things that those tools together can do that Layout Builder really can't, or at least can't easily. And my slides, there was a bit.ly link at the beginning. Let me see if I can get over to that. And I think someone did also post it in the chat, but bit.ly/component-int.
Brian, we're still live. there's someone asking, John Alvin, asking if you will share your slides with us, because there's lots of good stuff in there.
Yep. Yeah, sorry for the confusion there. I thought because the screen share dropped out that the session dropped out. But yeah, so I posted them in the chat. Oh yeah, people are saying that they could hear me. It's still early in the morning over here. Yeah, I posted the slides in the chat. It's bit.ly/component-int. Also follow up on Twitter too. Another question, could you share or recommend the pattern library tool, if any, you folks are using in some real projects? Thanks. So I've been using Pattern Lab for quite a while, although recently I've used Storybook on some recent projects, and that Storybook in general really seems to be gaining a lot of momentum. And I think it might be a little bit tough for me to go back to Pattern Lab in some cases. And one of the other big advantages for Storybook is that it has a wide variety of support for the different JavaScript frameworks. So it's going to work with more things and more types of projects. Cool. I think that's all the questions. Thanks everybody for joining the talk. Sorry for briefly thinking I was offline. But yeah, happy to share, happy to talk about the stuff outside of this session, and everybody enjoy the rest of DrupalCon.